Hi, everyone. We're just giving a short time period for everybody to log in. So we'll get started in just a few minutes, or less than a minute. Okay, great. So my name is Deirdre White, and I am with the Association of State Drinking Water Administrators. I am one of the co-chairs of the Source Water Collaborative, along with Lynn Thorpe of Clean Water Action. And I want to welcome you all to today's webinar on how to participate in Clean Water Act permits to protect drinking water sources. Next. For those of you who are not familiar with the Source Water Collaborative, we are a group of 30 associations, organizations, and federal agencies that work together and with our members and stakeholders to integrate source water protection into key decision-making processes at the local level. Next. This is a screenshot of our website where we have lots of resources to help many different types of partners who are looking to engage in source water protection activities across the country. And next, in addition to the guide we're talking about today, we also have this Clean Water Act and Safe Drinking Water Act infographic shown here on our website that will help users learn how to engage in all of the different Clean Water Act programs. Next. This slide is to let you know that today's webinar recording will be available on our YouTube channel in about a week. And we also have a LinkedIn and X page if you'd like to follow us on social media. And you can also sign up for news alerts on our website to find out more about news, events, and webinars like this. Next. This is the cover of the new guide that we're going to be discussing during today's webinar. The guide was developed by a few of the Source Water Collaborative members and other contributors. And I just want to stop here and say that this is a great example of the kind of work that the Source Water Collaborative can do. It is really the essence of what the Source Water Collaborative is all about, which is connecting with our members and their constituents to help drive national collaboration efforts among partners and stakeholders at the local, state, and regional levels. And these are our presenters who will be talking today, including myself, that will walk us through the guide and also share some real examples of how they provided comments on Clean Water Act discharge permits to protect their drinking water sources. I also want to say thank you to the other authors, reviewers, and contributors listed here whose contributions were essential for developing the guide. Next. And here is a QR code to get quick access to the guide, and we will also put a link in the chat for you all. Next. And I want to share the background story on how this guide came to be. So back in March of 2022, Jennifer Peters of Clean Water Action and I put together a session for the AWWA Sustainable Water Management Conference that was held in Denver. And our session was on holistic approaches to protect drinking water sources from PFAS, or poor and polyfluoral alkyl substances. So David Danny with the Colorado Drinking Water Program and Meg Parrish, who was then with the Colorado Clean Water Program, joined us for that session to provide a presentation on PFAS discharge permitting and lessons learned for downstream public water systems in their state. And I want to give credit here to Erica Pocken, who is also one of our presenters today, who is in the audience and specifically suggested the idea of developing this guide that we're talking about today. Next. So this slide shows an overview of the purpose of the guide and also shows the table of contents. So It is for providing comments on any type of NPDES or National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit under the Clean Water Act. It provides information for addressing any contaminant that has the potential to impact drinking water sources, including PFAS. And it is for public water systems and stakeholders to understand the permits and which permits they want to review, and then be able to provide comments for potentially developing or changing effluent limits in the discharge, or requiring the permittee to do additional monitoring, or possibly even requiring downstream notifications of releases for particular contaminants. This slide also gives you a glimpse of the table of contents that our presenters are going to cover the details on each of the sections today. Next. And this slide just provides a quick glimpse of the tools in the guide that you'll hear more about from our presenters that can be used to determine the location of facilities with NPDES permits, as well as finding out more information about the NPDES permits and also PFAS sources. Next. For a little housekeeping, as we get started today, we encourage you to add questions for speakers throughout the webinar. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end of the webinar, which is scheduled to end at 3:15 p.m. Eastern Time. Please be sure to add your speaker questions in the Q&A box pictured here and not in the chat. Next. Okay, so before we get started, we have a poll question for everyone. And if you could just provide your responses here to the poll, or if you're unable to access the poll, you can put in the chat whether you are with a drinking water system, an NGO, local government, federal government, or other. And we'll just give people a few seconds here to respond to the poll. All right, so it's great. It looks like we have a good mix of participants on the meeting today. So thanks so much. All right, and we will go ahead and start with our next, actually our first presenter today, and that is Jennifer Peters with Clean Water Action. So Jennifer, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Deirdre, and thank you everyone for being here today. We're really excited to talk to you about our toolkit that we've been working on for a long time now. So next slide, please. All right, I'm just going to give a very quick overview of the NPDES permitting process. So of course, the Clean Water Act safeguards waters of the US by limiting pollution, and NPDES permit, the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permits, are a very important tool for limiting point source discharges into waters of the US. And all point discharges need a NPDES permit. And these permits are authorized for 5 years, so they're supposed to be renewed every 5 years. Most permits are issued by states, but they can also be issued by tribes or in some cases EPA. It's important to know that all draft permits are required to have a public review and comment process. And, when we're thinking about NPDES permits and the Clean Water Act in general, it's a joint responsibility of the US EPA and states. EPA is responsible for, updating effluent guidelines, as well as putting out water quality criteria. And states are responsible for their own water quality standards, although those standards have to be approved by EPA. And as I already mentioned, most states issue their own NPDES permits. All right, next slide. And before I get into some more of my presentation, we had a few quick poll questions as well. So next poll question, please. So we're curious to know, what is your level of knowledge about NPDES permits? So please select good, some, little, or none. right, the answers should be popping up in a few seconds.
Jennifer, looks like we're having an issue sharing the results, but it's about half and half, good and some.
Okay, all right. Excellent. Okay. And then we have a follow-up poll question to that, the one we just had. So are you able to share that poll question?
Working on getting that launched right now. Can you see
Okay.
that?
I cannot. Um,
We're having an issue getting this launched. Maybe you want to ask to have folks put an answer in the chat.
Yeah, and so the follow-up question is, for those of you that have engaged in NPDES permits in any way, we wanted to know what sector you represent, if you're a drinking water system, if you're a nonprofit, if you're a local or state government, federal government, or representing another sector. All right, looks like answers are coming in the chat from all over the place. That's great. Thank you all for bearing with our technical difficulties. And I think I'm ready to go to the next slide. All right. So some of the basic elements that must be included in a NPDES permit include, of course, any pollutant limits for specific pollutants. Those are called effluent limits in the NPDES permit. Monitoring requirements are very important, as well as any best management practices, compliance schedule, reporting, record keeping, all that good administrative stuff, operational rules, as well as for publicly owned treatment works, so sewage treatment plants. Those permits are also required to have, pre-treatment and biosolids management plans are also part of those permits. And that image there, that just shows the states that have NPDES program authorizations. And so it's kind of a mix, like some states are fully authorized, meaning they do their NPDES permits, they also do their pre-treatment and biosolids. Some states just do permits and biosolids, some do permits and pre-treatment. So just just wanted to let you know what that image is referring to. Next slide, please. It's important to remember that all NPDES permits, they have to ensure that water quality standards are achieved, including standards to protect drinking water sources. And they also must control all pollutants or pollutant parameters which may be discharged at a level which will have the reasonable potential to cause or contribute to an excursion above any state water quality standard. Next slide, please. So how do you find out about a draft permit? I realized when I was just looking at this a while ago, I neglected to put another important bullet here, which would be, maintain a relationship or developing and maintain a relationship with your state permit writer. Because in some cases, there may actually be opportunities to share information or express concerns you might have about a particular facility that's impacting your drinking water system outside of like a normal draft permit reviewing process. So I just want to throw that out there as another way to find out about finding out in advance of when a draft permit might be coming out. But of course, you can request that your state permit writing authority notify you of any facilities upstream of your drinking water intake or within your source water protection area. Most states have permit notification lists, and you can request to be added to that email list. And EPA does put all of their issued permits online as well as most states, but not all states. But you can if your state does not put that information online, you can certainly request that the state permit writer sends you a copy of that draft. It's important in addition, when you're, requesting these draft materials, you also want to be comparing what's being drafted to what's currently on the books with the current permit, as well as the fact sheet associated with that permit. And you might, in addition to, tracking permits that are coming up for renewal, you might also want to be tracking permit modifications as well, which there are several things that can trigger a permit modification. That basically just means there could be conditions within that 5-year lifespan of a permit that a state could decide, oh, we need to open this up because, for instance, EPA has made changes to effluent limit guidelines for coal plants, for instance. So this coal plant facility now, under the effluent guidelines from EPA need to be following more stringent pollutant limits, for instance. Next slide, please. Just some quick basic comment submission logistics. Of course, you want to submit your comments on time, so they will be considered. Most states have a pretty quick comment period of 30 days, but I have seen for some larger facilities or for some very complicated permits, sometimes they have 60 to 90 days because there is a lot of technical information, of course, for stakeholders to review. And also, if you feel like you don't have enough time, like definitely ask for an extension, and many states will give you an extension if you have a good reason. And oftentimes, many stakeholders ask for an extension. If a state has a specific formatting or template that they would like your comment to be in, make sure you follow that preferred format. And then, if no template is provided for you to follow, we recommend submitting in Word and in a PDF format just to make it as easy as possible for the person reading through your comments to consider and respond to them. Next slide, please. These are some more, detailed comment submission tips. You want to provide information. If you're a drinking water system, you want to provide all the relevant information on your system. We recommend that you number each of your comments and ask for the state to respond directly to your comment. And you can consider using a chart to make it easier for them to track. It's important to cite where in the the draft permit that you're commenting. You also want to be specific. Like, don't just say, I want stronger PFAS limits. Say, the effluent limit for PFOA should be 4 parts per trillion, for instance. Next slide, please. So how do you decide what permit to focus on? These are 3 steps that we recommend that you take. First of all, you want to determine the location of facilities that could be affecting your source waters. And then, those are some tools that could be helpful for doing that. Deirdre already mentioned DW maps. If you have a source water protection plan, that's another good place to look. You also want to look at the existing in-stream conditions. And there are some great tools, including DW maps, EPA's How's My Waterway. You want to look at any state impaired waters list or any associated cleanup plans associated with those impaired waters, the TMDLs. And then, of course, you want to determine what your pollutants of concern are. And we recommend developing an inventory of contaminants similar to what the state of Oregon has done. And we have an example of that in the toolkit that you can take a look at. Next slide, please. This chart is also in our toolkit, and it just lists some common pollutants of concern and which facilities are associated with those pollutants. And again, this is just another tool to help you identify the types of facilities that are likely to be releasing the pollutants that are most concerned to your drinking water system. Next slide. All right. I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to draw your attention to the last bullet point here, which is that in December of 2022, EPA issued a memo that directs permit writers to notify public water systems of draft permits that have PFAS conditions. And so we have a couple of associated poll questions that we want to ask. Is the technology working for that?
Let's give it a try.
Okay.
Okay. Not sure why we're having technical difficulties with this today, so let me try one more time.
Okay.
Sorry about that. It looks like it's not launching.
So I think because we have two poll questions, I'm just going to ask one of them now and ask people to put it in the chat. The one that I was personally most interested in, which, I just mentioned that EPA has directed state permit writers to notify downstream drinking water systems when there is a draft permit upstream that has PFAS conditions or proposed PFAS conditions in that permit. So I'm really curious to know from the drinking water system folks that are on the phone, or excuse me, that are on the in the Zoom, have you received notifications from state permit writers? Okay, I just saw a note in the chat about, can we send a copy of the memo? The memo, we have a link to the memo in our guide, and I can pull it up in a few minutes and put it in the chat as well for folks. But yeah, I'd love to know if anyone has experienced getting notification from their state permit writer. Oh, thank you. Someone already popped it in the chat for us from Pam. I'm seeing a no. I was hoping. All right. Well, my time is up, so I'm going to pass it on to the next speaker. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. Okay, up next, we have Meg Parrish with the Environmental Integrity Project. So go ahead, take it away, Meg.
Thanks so much, Deirdre. And thank you all so much for being here today. We're really excited about this guide and excited to talk to you about it. Next slide, please. Next slide. With Environmental Integrity Project, we're a watchdog organization. I'm senior water quality attorney there. Next slide. So I'm going to be talking about a little bit, I think Jen talked about kind of big picture Water Clean Water Act permits, how to figure out kind of what permits you want to be focusing on to protect your drinking water source. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the nuts and bolts. You've decided to focus on a certain facility, you know the pollutants you're worried about. Now you've got this paper in front of you. What are you looking for? Next slide, please. One just threshold thing to think about is what kind of NPDES permit is it? Different kind of waste streams and different sort of size facilities will have, their permits will look fairly different. So if you're worried about, say, a auto recycler, industrial stormwater from an auto recycler upstream of your facility, that might be covered by a general permit called an industrial stormwater permit. And that permit will go out with kind of general conditions for all of the auto recyclers in the state. And so that's when you're going to be commenting on that, not on kind of the particulars of the facility that's right upstream from you. So that's a general permit. Most large facilities, which we're kind of assuming are the ones that folks are going to be focusing on here, like large POTWs and large industrial facilities, are going to be covered by an individual permit that will go out for public notice and just be talking about that one permit. Next slide, please. So you open the draft permit, and assuming it's a permit with numeric limits, as I'll talk about in a second, not all permits have numeric limits, but let's say this one, yours does. What do you look for? First thing you want to look for is the chart of those limits. If you're looking at a POTW, there's probably only one of these. There'll be a chart for kind of every outfall. So every kind of pipe that's going into that receiving water. An industrial facility might have 10, 20 different outfalls. So they'll have a chart for each one of those. And on top of the chart, it'll usually say what that waste stream is. Is it industrial process water? Is it industrial stormwater? Something like that. This is an example of a pretty typical small POTW permit with kind of the basic limits that you might see. Things to look at here where it says report, that means there isn't a limit, but they have to monitor. You'll notice that in this permit, they're limiting the quantity of some pollutants like TSS, that's suspended solids. as well as the concentration. Some states will only have concentration-based limits, but they'll limit the flow of the facility, which kind of works out to the same thing. One important piece when you're looking at these charts is the monitoring frequency. This can be anything from continuous to every day to once a year. And so that can be really important in terms of whether this information is actually going to be useful. Next slide. So here's another example of a kind of a more complicated effluent limit chart. This is actually only part of a chart from a oil refinery. And so you'll see again that we've got some of these report. We've got the monitoring frequency. All we've got here is concentration-based limits because the flow of this facility is limited, which limits the quantity. One thing you'll see here is that some of these pollutants have two different limits, and that's because they have what is called a compliance schedule, which means that the state has decided that the facility needs a little bit of time to be able to install treatment to meet these permit limits. So for instance, for chloride in this chart, they don't have a limit for chloride until 2030. And then in 2030, they've got this 250 milligrams per liter. So you're looking at these charts. What do you ask yourself? Lots of numbers. Big questions. Are these numbers right? And then kind of bigger, are these the right pollutants? You know the pollutants that you're worried about. Let's say you're worried about bromide. Is there a limit for bromide? Is there a monitoring requirement for bromide? If there is a limit for bromide, but there's a compliance schedule, is that compliance schedule reasonable? Is giving the facility 4 years to find an engineer and make a plan reasonable? Or could they do that in a shorter amount of time? Next slide, please. Jen kind of mentioned other great things to have when you're looking at the permit, the fact sheet, the compliance record for the facility. Does it have violations? What has been its monitoring data? In the last permit cycle you can find that on an EPA site called ECHO that we have instructions for in the guide. And then permit applications. Next slide, please. So permit applications can be a little scary. They're huge often, especially if it's a large industrial facility. But most states will follow an EPA standard application, and Form C can be very useful for you. So this is the part of the permit application that will kind of list lots and lots of pollutants, lots of pollutants that are not going to be kind of typically monitored in your permit that you won't see in kind of ECHO. This is, every, kind of lots and lots of metals, lots and lots of different toxics. And the facility has to say whether the pollutant is present or not. And then sometimes they have to sample for them all of them. And sometimes they only have to sample for the ones they believe are present. But it gives you information about a lot of pollutants that you wouldn't otherwise have. So, if you're worried about, we've got aluminum on here, you're going to see, at least 1 or 2 aluminum samples. Next slide, please. So where do these limits come from? We've got a lot more information about this in the guide, but just kind of basic overview. Next slide. So if your permit has numeric limits, 2 typical places where they come from are those water quality-based limits that Jen was talking about and technology-based limits. Next slide. Just a reminder, not all permits have numeric limits. Some will have what we call practice-based limits. You'll particularly see this with stormwater permits, with CAFOs, municipal stormwater permits called MS4s almost exclusively have practice-based limits, and those are written a little differently than what we're going to be talking about today. The most important thing about practice-based limits, I think, is that they are not necessarily weaker than numeric limits, as long as they are written in a way that doesn't allow for loopholes and has kind of a robust enforcement mechanism that they can actually be enforced. So if you've got a practice-based permit, read it very carefully. Next slide. Right, so just a little more about these water quality-based limits that Jen was talking about. What the state will do is they'll designate a certain water as with different classified uses, including as a drinking water source. They set standards to protect that source, and then they include limits in the permit so that that standard isn't exceeded. An example for this, and I just say this one because the numbers are easy, is copper. The MCL for copper, 1.3 milligrams per liter. That's also the EPA criteria, which is usually the basis for a water quality standard. So next slide, please. So you've got this 1.3 milligrams per liter copper water quality standard. And then the permit writer is looking at a facility and saying, okay, do I need to put a copper limit into this permit? And what does that copper limit need to be? Usually they'll only include limits for pollutants that have what's called a reasonable potential to cause or contribute to an exceedance of the water quality standard. So they'll look at, does this facility already discharge copper? Is there copper already in the water? How much copper is in the water? They'll also look at the flow. Oftentimes big facilities will get tighter limits than small facilities. Next slide, please. A really important water quality standard to be thinking about is the narrative standard. So the wording varies a little bit in different states, but the big idea is that waters cannot be polluted by toxic substances that interfere with uses like as a drinking water source. Next slide, please. Right, so what are you going to be asking for in your permit comment about these water quality based limits? We've got a lot more of this in the guide, but I would just want to highlight one particular use that, or one particular request that I think is probably on folks' minds right now. Now that we have MCLs for PFAS, even if they're not necessarily effective, we know kind of EPA has sort of said this is the level of PFAS in drinking water that we would consider safe. So those limits can be the basis for one of those water quality standards we're talking about, like copper, that 1.3 milligrams per liter. So, you could ask your state to kind of establish those PFAS MCLs as the water quality standards for PFAS. That takes a long time. What you can also do if you're looking at this permit is say, hey, we've got this narrative water quality standard that you can't add pollutants that are going to interfere with the drinking water use. Let's set limits based on those PFAS MCLs under that narrative water quality standard. Now, you're going to think about dilution and things like that. So the limits might actually be higher than those MCLs, but the MCLs would be the basis for them. One other sort of nutrients, which we talk about a lot in the guide. Similarly, you can, a lot of states have only narrative nutrient standards, which are not necessarily always helpful. They'll say things like, until the you can't have the algae get so bad that it interferes with the use. But if you're a drinking water source, you don't want the algae to be getting that bad in the first place. So you can ask for kind of a numeric limit so that you don't get to that narrative limit for nutrients or for algae. So phosphorus and nitrogen. Next slide, please. Really quick, some states have other protections for water quality or for drinking water sources. I shout out to Tom Fitzgerald in Kentucky, who alerted me to their great policy where you cannot have a public a discharge of domestic wastewater 5 miles upstream of a public of a PWS. If you know of other sort of these state protections, we would love to know about them and kind of put them together as a resource. Another thing to think about is anti-degradation, which is a more complicated water quality protection for high quality waters, but can be a really good tool if your source water is one of those more protected high quality tier 2 waters. Next slide, please. So we've got those water quality based limits, and then we've got technology based limits. Generally, there's 3 kinds. POTW ones, which are fairly basic. They are going to be kind of those TSS standards you saw on that first permit chart. Industries will have federal limits set in regulation if they're in sort of certain industrial categories. The tricky thing about those limits, they're great. They're often very clear. Permit writers will do a great job of kind of putting them into permits. But they're very old. So they won't usually have limits for nutrients. They won't have limits at this time for PFAS. They may not have limits for things that you're concerned about because they haven't been updated since the 80s when we didn't have all these MCLs. So a really important tool for you are going to be these case-by-case technology-based limits, which are supposed to kind of fill in those gaps. Next slide. So what you can ask for, you're looking at the limits, say you're concerned about benzene. There's no, because, you're worried about an oil refinery, that benzene is one of the pollutants of concern from that refinery. There's no, federal limit for benzene as in those ELGs. So what you can do is ask for a case-by-case technology-based limit for benzene. And, add that protection to the permit. And this is, I think, something that it's a great tool, and it's something that states apply inconsistently sometimes. So it's a great thing to look at in the permit. Next slide. All right, last but not least, monitoring. Monitoring is a great tool. Let's say you don't know if a pollutant is being discharged by a facility, but you are concerned it is. Maybe it's associated with the industrial process. Ask for monitoring. Then you're kind of building up that knowledge and that information. So when the permit is renewed 5 years later, you and the state will have the information to evaluate whether or not a limit is needed. Next slide, please. So we talked about a lot of stuff. Where can you find it all? The guide has a permit comment template that includes a lot of these pieces that I've talked about. We would love for you to use this comment template. And if you do use it, we would love to see what those comments look like. And also any feedback you have on the template. And we'll include a link to the template in the chat. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Meg. And as a reminder, if people could put any questions in the Q&A box, and we did have some people that talked about some of the work their states are doing in response to your question, Meg. So be sure to check that out in the chat. All right, next up, we have Erica Pocken from American Water. The person I had mentioned inspired the development of the guide. So take it away, Erica. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Deidre. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for being with us and spending, well, I guess it's good afternoon. I guess it depends on where you are, but thank you for spending your time with us regardless. My name is Erica Pocken. I'm the current Director of Source Water Protection for American Water across our national footprint, but today I'm representing and speaking on behalf of West Virginia American Water. And on the first slide, I will just jump right into the information about our system and the setting in which we operate. So West Virginia American Water is a regulated public water utility. We have operated in West Virginia since 1886, so quite a while. We do serve over 500,000 people across the entire state. So we are in 22 counties. And it represents about a third of the total population there in West Virginia. We do operate 7 water treatment facilities, also groundwater stations that are actually all in our eastern panhandle that you see up at the top of the picture there. And then we also have operations of 5 wastewater treatment plants across the state as well that you can see in the photo are in the darker blue areas. So the intakes that we operate are on a variety of different rivers. We are on, the largest one is the Ohio River. We are also on the Elk River, the West Fork River, the New River, including Bluestone Lake. And then we also have some various reservoirs in southern West Virginia and Bluefield. And then on the next slide, I will talk a little bit about just our source water protection zones and just the process in which we worked through to identify upstream facilities, including one that we commented on their NPDES permit. So West Virginia American, we adopted the zones of concern that were established by the West Virginia Bureau of Public Health. You can see those, the map of those there on the slide. The red is what we call the zone of critical concern, or the ZCC. Its length is based on a 5-hour time of travel to the intake, plus about a quarter of a mile below the intake. So the width of that is 1,000 foot from the bank of the principal stream, and then 500 foot from the tributaries that drain into that principal stream. And in the green, you'll see this our zone of peripheral concern. And what that does is extend our critical concern zone by another 5-hour time of travel. So that protects or creates, like, if you will, a protection zone for 10 hours above our intake. And then the width is the same as the ZCC. So the decision for us in terms of which NPDES permits are of greatest concern for our source water really depends on a variety of different factors. The guide really describes how to determine those. It goes into the locations of discharging facilities, the conditions of water bodies, pollutants that we might be concerned about, which some of the other speakers already spoke about. And which facilities, could be discharging those specific pollutants. So at West Virginia American, we have a specific process. I don't know how formal it is, but we do begin by reviewing available data, which includes federal, state, and local regulatory databases and different assessments. And we scan just for certain regulatory programs, such as, I'll say, oil and gas, mining, discharge permits are the bigger ones. Above ground storage tanks, we do have those regulations in West Virginia. And so that's our approach, is utilizing the resources that are listed in the guide already, and that some of the speakers have spoke about. They're also listed on the slide here. And I'll describe the tools in a little bit more detail, just how we utilize them, but it's really a matter of scanning the watershed. DW Maps is a great resource for that. Reviewing just facilities compliance history in EPA's ECHO database, evaluating risks, as well as just locating potential Superfund sites, TRI reports. So there's a variety of different things. And then on the next slide, I just want to talk a little bit about one of the tools that we utilize, and that is the drinking water mapping application to source water, to protect source waters, or we call it DW Maps. So it is an online mapping tool that provides just relevant data and information for water utilities or other users to locate potential sources of contamination and polluted waterways in relation to drinking water facilities. So on the screen is just or on the slide is a screenshot of our specific watershed from DW Maps, that just to walk you through the process and sort of, I guess, what we mean when we say scanning the watershed. So we literally start at the intake and move outward into the watershed, evaluating each potential source of contamination point. We do limit the layers that we have turned on that are specific to what we're wanting to look at, just to reduce time and effort, and just make it more meaningful in terms of what we're looking for. So and we surf the watershed, seeing what there is, and just digging out further into specific sites or facilities that we could be of concern. And so this specific screenshot is from our Huntington water treatment facility that is on the Ohio River. And there isn't a PFAS discharger that is located about 115 miles upstream from this facility. And on the next slide is just an example of the EPA's enforcement and compliance history website, and just for us to be able to search for facilities that are in the communities in which are inside of our zones of concern, just to assess their compliance with environmental regulations and be able to use that information as a piece of the puzzle in either identifying potential sources or deciding whose permits that we are interested in commenting on. So, and there's a variety of different things that we use this for, just searching, investigating pollution sources. You can search for EPA's enforcement cases, which is helpful. look at just different related maps focused on examining and creating enforcement, and then just also analyzing trends. So, and it can also, it has a, like a PFAS, I think it's called Analytical Tools, I believe is the name of it. Don't quote me there. But it can identify potential PFAS sources and locations as well. And so the tools include information on PFAS discharges from permitted sources, reports on spills containing PFAS, facilities or manufacturing or those that are importing PFAS, federal PFAS investigation sites, waste transfers. I mean, there's just a plethora of information focused on specifically on PFAS. And I believe also that there's drinking water sampling results as well. So on the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about one of the other items one of the other speakers had mentioned about getting on different types of lists. So in West Virginia, our West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection has what they call the DEP public notice mailing list. So we utilize this tool to get notifications about upcoming permit applications, renewals, different types of things that are happening in our state. But we're also a recipient of their DEP spill hotline, which is used across the state to report spills or accidental discharges. So this is just another way utilities can not only learn about upstream facilities, but also potentially receive reports that indicate potential contamination events. I will say, just mention real quick here that in the next slide, I'm going to go into like a specific example from commenting on a permit, but we also utilize one of these lists, not specifically to comment on a permit, but to be able to track and see spill events that were happening from specific PFAS dischargers upstream, to be able to comment to our regulatory agency about the concerns that we had for their frequent spills related to PFAS. So just one example. And then on the last slide, I just, like I mentioned, wanted to bring up a specific permit that West Virginia American Water commented on. In the guide, there is a comment letter, I believe it's Appendix A, that includes some of the verbiage examples that we used, but we also submitted very specific comments. And just to go into some of those, the draft facts sheet acknowledged human health studies were ongoing. And let me back up for a minute. So this particular permit it's the Comores facility that is upstream from our Huntington facility that's on the Ohio River, that is a known discharger for PFAS. So it's about 115 miles upstream, and it was one that we decided during their permit renewal cycle to have formal comments on those, in addition to the other things I had mentioned about commenting on their spills. But they did do that in terms of they had the draft fact sheet. We commented that we believe there should be a condition in the permit that the DEP could modify effluent limitations outside of the permit renewal cycle that could be based on any kind of new information. As we all know, those very likely going to be new information to protect human health. So that was one of our comments. The second comment, the draft permit limited discharges of two specific compounds for PFAS that you can see on the slide there, but it did not address any other PFAS substances that might be discharged. So we believe that a thorough analysis could be conducted to identify the presence of other compounds and then submitted for public comment. So, as well as just appropriate limitations for monitoring and reporting could be required. So, and should be established accordingly. So, and then the third comment for this specific permit renewal, there was a 3-year implementation schedule for meeting the water quality-based effluent limits, which we believe presented a concern that discharges may result in downstream concentration that would exceed health advisory levels. At the time, their health advisory levels, but the facility's compliance history indicated that it had experienced and may continue to experience issues meeting that criteria with their current technology. And so we acknowledged that it would take time to develop and implement technology to meet the effluent limitations, the final ones. However, in the meantime, water utilities can bear additional operating costs for monitoring and treatment that results in increased costs to the customer. So we did request consideration for a mechanism for downstream water utilities to seek reimbursement for cost related to that. And the fourth and final formal comment on this permit was that the draft permit required immediate reporting to the DEP in the event of a spill or any accidental discharges that exceeded their maximum daily discharge limitation. And so we requested to include a permit condition that also required the facility to immediately notify downstream water utilities, including our Huntington facility, if any of those situations were to occur. Or alternatively, we also have the Orsenco, so you're probably familiar with the Ohio River Valley Water Sanitation Commission. So it's another avenue that we believe that could potentially provide notifications to an early notification to utilities. So we also had some other items in the permit that weren't formal comments, if you will, but just, I guess, recognizing and supporting would be the proper terms of their approach of using the what was available in terms of health advisory levels for establishing permits and a variety of other things that we supported the agency on. And thanked them for their efforts. But the DEP did provide a formal response to address how they were going to address these comments. So that's it. That was, I wanted to talk through some of that, and I will hand it back to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Erica. And next up, we have Richard Stuck from the Greater Cincinnati Waterworks, who's going to share another example for us. So Rich, are you ready to go?
I sure am.
Okay,
So
great.
thanks, Deirdre. As she said, my name is Rich Stuck. I'm the Source Water Protection Manager for Greater Cincinnati Waterworks. Next slide, please. A little bit of background about Greater Cincinnati Waterworks. We have 2 water treatment plants, a groundwater plant, which is located northwest of downtown Cincinnati. It's called the Charles M. Bolton Treatment Plant. It comprises a 40 million gallon a day groundwater plant that comprises about 12% of our daily production. And then we have our older, much larger plant, the Richard Miller Treatment Plant, located southeast of downtown Cincinnati. It's a 240 million gallon per day surface water plant with our source water for that particular facility is, like Erica's Huntington plant, is the Ohio River. And together we served water to about 1.1 million people every day. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk today 2 different case studies. One where we used the commenting on NPDES permits for our groundwater plant, which was a relatively straightforward case study, and then a second more complicated one for our surface water plant. So I'm going to start with the easy one first. And several years ago, well, just a little bit of background, our groundwater plant, there's a creek that runs right through our well field, and that creek happens to be the receiving stream for the discharges from a local landfill, fairly large landfill. And that landfill is located about 3 miles upstream from our well field. By and large, the creek is flowing over bedrock, so there's very little infiltration of groundwater until it gets to about a mile and a half to its mouth, and it transitions into a sand and gravel situation, and it does lose water to the aquifer that we use as our source water. So we very much had this facility on our radar screen, and modifications at the facility initiated a permit modification, and that permit modification actually was fairly high profile, and it generated a public meeting. So GCWW, we had gotten a copy of the draft permit, kind of like we talked about throughout the guide. And we were prepared to comment on the draft permit in writing, but when the possibility came up for the public meeting, we decided to participate in the public meeting. Gave us a great opportunity to talk directly to the permit writers, explain to them why we had this concern as a groundwater plant relative to a surface water discharge permit. And as a result of those public comments, the permit writers did include a caveat in the permit that required the facility to provide direct notification to GCWW in the event of any plant upsets or non-compliance issues. That requirement, actually, that was several permit cycles ago, 2.5 permit cycles ago at least, and that has been carried through each permit subsequent renewal, and we'll get notification from the state so that they can update the contact information, make sure everything is included in the permit. Everything that is included in the permit is current. So as a result of those changes, it was very positive for us. We do get several notifications from the facility, the most recent of which was in May of this year, after they had a release of mixed stormwater and leachate due to a high rain event. That notification allows us to implement our contingency plan, which includes altering our well pumping configuration, and that helps minimize the impact to the groundwater at our plant. So it's a very positive outcome. Next slide, please. So switching now our focus a little bit, we're going to switch over to our surface water plant. As I said, it's the Richard Miller Treatment Plant. It's the larger of our two plants. It's located on the Ohio River. We draw water directly from the Ohio River through two intakes. The map on the screen shows two things. It shows the outline of the Ohio River watershed in red line, and then the red shaded area is the watershed. That is a fairly large area. As you can see, it's about 71,000 square miles. It includes portions of Ohio, most of West Virginia, portions of Eastern Kentucky and Western Pennsylvania, and as well as a couple of fairly large urban areas like Pittsburgh and Columbus, Charleston, West Virginia. Despite its reputation, we believe the Ohio River is a very robust source water, but it's not without its challenges. So if we can have the next slide. Let's talk about one of those challenges in 1,4-dioxane. For those of you unfamiliar with 1,4-dioxane, it's a colorless liquid that mixes completely with water. It's an industrial contaminant. It's used as a stabilizer by industry for stabilizing chlorinated compounds. And it is the byproduct of certain manufacturing processes, including the manufacture of plastics. It was included in the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule 3, and the US EPA has studied this compound to a point, and it has listed it as a probable human carcinogen. 1,4-dioxane is persistent in the environment. It's highly mobile in water, and in fact, it likes being in water. And it is not easily removed by common water treatment technologies, including granular activated carbon, which we happen to have at our treatment plant. US EPA has issued a health advisory for that compound at 0.35 micrograms per liter, which is not an MCL, so it's not enforceable, but it is a guide that we use for evaluating our water quality. Next slide, please. So as you might have guessed, we saw 1,4-dioxane in our source water when we did the UCMR 3 sampling. And that led to two things. One was the question of, if that's there, can we get rid of it? And there was an engineering team that was taking care of evaluating treatment. And then the question that came to me was, where's it coming from? And that was a question I needed to dig into. Didn't have a lot of information available at the time. This is roughly 2015 at the time. And so we turned to the only information we really had at our disposal, which was the UCMR data for all the surface water utilities on the Ohio River. And I bring this up because unlike, looking at things from a source water protection standpoint, we're trying to back our way into trying to find out where the source of this particular compound was, and determining whether or not it was even a point source or if it was something that we could manage. So you can see the data here moving left to right, downstream from Pittsburgh to Cairo. And it does look like, about a third of the way down the river, maybe there was a jump in the concentrations, and that kind of lent some idea or some credibility to the thought that perhaps that this was a point source. Next slide, please. Taking that information, we then turn to other online sources, and you've heard mention of the TRI, or the Toxics Release Inventory. This is a screenshot of the dashboard for what's called the Single Chemical Report, available under that in that database. And there's a lot of interesting information here. I'm going to go into a couple panels here in the next couple of slides But the map in the upper left-hand corner of the dashboard was of extreme importance to us. As we zoomed into our watershed and our upstream area, we noticed a couple of things. One is that in our inner protection areas, there were no sources of 1,4-dioxane listed in the TRI. There were 3 sources listed in or around our watershed upstream of us. It turned out one of those was easy to eliminate because it was just outside the boundaries of our watershed. But the other 2, we had to dig a little bit deeper. One turned out to be very, very small and not really capable of producing the concentrations that we were seeing. But the third facility was discharging at a fairly significant quantities of 1,4-dioxane. Next slide. So burrowing into that information that was available to us, and this was the 2021 version of the TRI. The TRI is updated every year, so every year is going to be a little bit different, but this happens to be 2021 information. And you can see the facility, Apple Grove, is a riverside city in West Virginia. It's about 186 miles upstream of us. And it was reporting a discharge of 1,4-dioxane, actually to the point where it was in the top 5 facilities nationwide of facilities releasing that compound. And if you dig in a little bit deeper, you find that of the facilities discharging directly to water, so not going to a POTW or not going into any other interim facility, but discharging directly to a surface water body, it represented about 56% of the total quantity. At 36,000 pounds, that's roughly 100 pounds per day coming from this facility. Next slide, please. So we got involved with the NPDES permit for this facility, and we found out that, in fact, the West Virginia DEP was trying to regulate that facility. We got to the 2016 permit cycle a little bit late, but West Virginia DEP did try to impose effluent limits. They gave them a fairly generous 5-year compliance schedule to get control of this particular discharge. But the company took a different approach, and that is that they decided to appeal the permit, which is a different wrinkle to that you have to be aware of as you delve into Clean Water Act permits. They were within their rights to appeal the permit to a body called the West Virginia Environmental Quality Board. This 5-year period was a little bit bumpy for the company. They wound up having to shut down for a little while during a bankruptcy. But at the end of that bankruptcy, they became operational again, and they were successful in their appeal. And that appeal resulted in the removal of the 1,4-dioxane discharge limits from the permit. Next slide. So we were not entirely happy with that outcome. We weren't happy with it at all, to be honest with you. And so that permit was high on our monitoring list, and we were keeping an eye on when the draft permit was going to come due for public comment, and that did in February of 2021. Once that permit was available for comment, we contacted a couple other utilities downstream, Louisville Water Company, West Virginia American Water, and the 3 utilities got all provided comments to West Virginia DEP. There were 2 others, West Virginia American Waters also provided comments, but the company themselves, they provided comments on the draft permit as well. Generally speaking, the comments from the water utilities were very supportive of what West Virginia DEP was trying to do, which is an important point, that sometimes you don't have to disagree with a permit to comment on it. Sometimes the regulating authority needs to hear what you're supporting and why you're supporting it, and that's the approach that we took with the bulk of our comments. Next slide. So this is just kind of an overview of the approach that we took with our comment letter. We opened up with some general discussion, introduced our utility, tried to indicate why we had a stake in this permit being 186 miles away. And we used the opening part of our comment letter to reiterate some of that TRI data that we had. We reviewed the company's past history of appealing effluent limits and the fact that they had previously had a compliance schedule. And we used that as the basis for setting the scene of why we were commenting in the first place. Specifically, we requested changes to the compliance schedule in the 2021 draft. We supported, as I said, we supported very strongly West Virginia's DEP's draft effluent limits, since we believe they were, and we modeled that they were protective of drinking water. And we supported West Virginia DEP's compliance milestones, which they had included during the 2-year compliance schedule. Next slide. So as that permit became finalized, there were some changes from the draft to the final. We found out in that process that the company had appealed or had provided their own comments, and as you might imagine, they were looking for changes in the other direction. The regulators used the fact that we had commented as the basis for denying some of those changes or some of those requested changes, which was gratifying to see. They also used our interest to impose interim effluent limits in the final permit as well. The company once again appealed the permit up to and including removing the effluent limits for 1,4-dioxane based on a number of items that they did not agree with. So this time we were prepared for that, and we inserted ourselves into the appeal process, which was something that we did not have any experience with. That we were getting at this point, getting a lot of help from outside legal partners. And I did want to point out the fact that we were recognized by the board as what's called interveners, which means that we had standing in this permit, even though we were downstream pretty good distance. One thing that's important to take away from this part of the process is that had we not commented on the draft permit, it's not clear whether or not we would actually been recognized as interveners. I guess we'll never know at this point, but it does not seem like we might have had an uphill battle at the very least to be recognized as an intervener if we had not commented on the draft. It went through about an 18-month period where all the activity turned over to the legal teams. I won't go into that, but at the very end, after 18 months of back and forth, we did get through the board without a hearing. Came to a consensus on an administrative order of consent, and the permit was ultimately finalized. Next slide. And that permit was finalized with drinking water effluent or with effluent limits that were protective of drinking water. So final words, just to kind of wrap things up, without the utility involvement, we've come to learn that it was likely the company would have succeeded in their appeal once again, resulting in another 5-year permit cycle, at least, of no effluent limits for this compound. The permit and the agreed order will reduce the 1,4-dioxane loading from this facility from over 100 pounds per day down to less than 1 pound per day. And this one, the red box, is one we're kind of proud of. In our view, we successfully shifted the burden of treatment of this compound to the polluter and away from our ratepayers, which is not a common outcome for source water protection. And just reiterate that the use of TRI and other environmental data from other sources, especially within US EPA, helped us affect a positive outcome, despite the fact that we're almost 200 miles downstream and in a completely different state. That's it.
Wow, thanks so much, Rich. That was really helpful in terms of understanding what you were able to do, what you can do, and providing some suggestions for other people that might be making comments. So I want to go ahead and see if we can launch a poll question here. Again, it hasn't been working, so I'm gonna see if I can go to the next one and see if we can get it. If not, the question that we're asking is which resources you would like to see on this topic in addition to the guide. Would you like to see, and if you could all just put this in the chat, more detailed case studies? It doesn't look like I can bring up the poll. So would you like to see more detailed case studies, more presentations like this, or would you like some technical assistance? So if you want to go ahead and put that in the chat, and then I think we have just a reminder on the next slide that, all right, and I'm saying that this will be available, the recording will be available on our website in the next week. And on the next slide, we have the QR code for accessing the guide. And I'll just pause here to take a few questions. And so this is for Rich specifically. And you can all turn on your cameras if you'd like, all of our speakers. Great, thank you. So does Cincinnati have concerns about contributions of 1,4-dioxane increasing to the Ohio River as a result of the Shell cracker plant in Beaver County, Pennsylvania? There's another question here too about some specifics on another company, which was in Apple Grove. So I don't know
Okay.
if you're able to answer those questions or.
Well, I can try. We have not done a whole lot of analysis with the cracker plant. We do have now 2023 TRI data is coming available, so we'll start to monitor what their discharges and what they're reporting with that data set. But at this point, we're waiting on kind of that to see whether or not that permit has to be on our top tier of monitoring permits. But certainly with the size of that plant and us being downstream, even though it's close to 400 miles, that's something that we'll keep an eye on.
Great. And there's another question about why the facilities permit appeal, was successful initially.
Yeah, we were not really a part of that appeal where they were successful, so I can't really speak to that. I don't know that any interveners were part of that particular appeal. They argued based on certain technical things that I don't recall right at the moment, but we weren't directly involved.
Okay, great. And then for anybody, do you have to ask for the permit application or are they typically available online?
Answer that one if that's helpful. It depends on the state. We actually have in the guide a chart that kind of has the public notice locations for different states and where you can find draft permits and sometimes permit applications. If you can't get if they don't post the permit application, contacting the permit writer and just asking them to email it to you often works. Some states will require open records, but most will send it to you informally. We have, at EIP, we actually have been sending letters and kind of asking a number of states to start adding the permit application as kind of part of their norm when they publish a draft comment or a draft permit for comments. So if they don't in your state, you might also just want to ask them to change their process. And many states have been pretty open to that.
Thank you, Meg. And we have another question about ECHO. Does ECHO integrate with EJ Screen? That's the environmental justice screening tool that EPA has to see impacts to overburdened communities. And I think, Jennifer, you indicated you would answer that question.
Yes, and the answer is yes. You can pull in information from EJ Screen when you're doing a facility search in ECHO. And I'm dropping now in the chat a link to a training that EPA did last year on exactly how to do that, how to be in ECHO and use information from EJ Screen. And I just give a shout out to the folks at EPA that are in charge of keeping ECHO up to date. They have a lot of amazing trainings on all sorts of different subjects. So I encourage you to check them out if you want to learn more. And they're also, anytime I've emailed them a question, they've gotten back to me right away as well. So I highly recommend using them as a resource.
Thanks so much. And it looks like people answered in the chat that they would like case studies. Some said all of the above, presentations, technical assistance. So if we could go to the next slide. We just hope that you all will take action now. And these are just some things that we put together for what you can do if you haven't done them already, is to start using the guide and mapping tools. Find out the information that you heard about from our presenters today, how how some contaminants might be impacting your drinking water sources, where to get the information on the permits and how to comment on them. Ask for help. Are there experts, local partners, or other drinking water utilities like the two we've heard from today that might be able to assist you? And if you go to the next slide here, you can send an email to us at info@sourcewatercollaborative.org to let us know if you have questions or if we can further assist you. The group here has been great in offering some assistance. We've also talked about potentially doing another session on this or a workshop or something like that. And it sounds like from your responses in the chat, a lot of you might be interested. Also provide your feedback and share your experience with us. We would love to hear more about it. And Meg, I see you took yourself off mute, so you want to also just chime in here.
Yes, and I think I can't put it in the chat, but maybe Christine can. We are also really interested in kind of putting together additional resources, particularly if you have done permit comments. We would love to see them so folks can use them as an example. If you know about a permit that has really good conditions to protect drinking water, maybe some of the more unusual things we've talked about, we would love to see that. Or if you know about kind of those state-specific protections. So I think maybe Christine can throw my email into the chat. And if you have any of those things and you want to share them, please send them my way and we'll do our best to publicly post them. Thanks.
And we do have a couple of questions in the chat. I'll just go over in the Q&A. And I'll just briefly share about states that have documented permit changes based on PFAS related comments. I know Colorado is one of them. Michigan has done it. I know North Carolina has done some changes to permits. So just FYI there. And then there's another question about permit data. So I think for that one, we'll follow up with you separately if that's okay. I just want to stop and just thank all of our presenters for participating today. You all provided such helpful information. This is a topic that we've heard from lots of water utilities and other stakeholders that will help them to protect their drinking water sources. So I really appreciate all of your contributions to the guide and to this webinar. And I want to thank everybody who listened in today and participated. And again, keep giving us that feedback. Ask questions. If we have other events as well, we will keep you all informed about those and maybe reach out to some of you individually to see if there's more we can do to help. So with that, I think we'll close out for the day, and again, thanks to everyone. So have a great afternoon. Thank you all.